These will be on the midterm too, right? This can be a source of...
Yes. Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. You really, the readings are going to be very important for the midterm. The better, if you've actually done the readings and the better you know the material, the easier the midterm will be. Because I'll ask, you know, provide 3 citations citing risks for this situation. It's like, oh yeah, Brooks says this, and DeMarco says this, and Webster said this over in this post. Bam, bam, bam. And those are the answers. They don't have to be lengthy. Usually it's just give me the citation. If it's the right citation, I'm like, fine. If the citation is sort of vague, well, it's Brooks chapter 2, it's kind of like, okay, we need something a little more specific than that. So, okay, the theme here has to do with the nature of talent and other qualifications for working in software engineering. This was an article I wrote for Byte magazine back when Byte existed, about 20 years ago, as you can see. And there's nothing particularly original about this, so I've probably got more direct feedback. This is, I mean, the web was barely around. So anyone trying to get a hold of me had to work to get my email address and so on. I got physical letters, so I probably got about 100 responses to this article, about 98 of which said, yes, this is right, why doesn't anyone ever talk about this? And we're going to go into more nuances in the second article. But in this one, my basic thought was, there are people who are really talented at IT. I have known, hired, worked with people who are more talented than I am, and I consider myself a fairly decent architect and programmer, but one of my hires was about 20 years younger than me, had a GED, and at the time I hired him was writing an object-oriented operating system on his own, just for kicks. I hired him as one of the developers at Pages, and during the last year at Pages, when I was spending all my time traveling with the CEO, trying to line up deals, basically being the technical sales lead for various negotiations, I pretty much turned all the architecture over to him, even though he's the youngest programmer on the team. Because he not only understood my architecture better than the other developers, and these were all outstanding developers. He not only understood it better, he made improvements to it. He'd say, well, why don't we do this? And I'd like to say, yeah, Peter, that's actually a really good idea. I like that. That's a significant improvement to my architecture. Let's put that in there. So, and my real trigger on this was when I came back to teach at BYU in 1985. When I graduated from BYU in '78, there were about 120 students in the program. When I came back and moved up here, I moved to Utah not to teach, I moved to Utah for other reasons, but in 1985, 7 years later, there were 1,000 students in the program, and you had to apply and be accepted. Now, one of the things that I don't have the diagram here, I can bring it up later, is that 1985 actually represented a tremendous peak in undergraduate computer science enrollment. And then it dropped off. And then peaked again in the late 90s because of the dot-com boom, and then it dropped off again. And it's slowly been rising since for about the last 10 years or so. But they were swamped, so you know they had 8 times the students in the program when I was there. And I was talking to my former faculty advisor, Gordon Stokes, and he said something that hit me. You know, we were talking about how much it had grown. I was teaching 3 sections of 142 with a total of 700 students. And he said, Bruce, he said, you know, it's funny. He said, we have like 8 times the number of students. He says, as far as I can tell, the number of really gifted students in the program is the same as when you were here. He said, not the same percentage, the same absolute number. So as far as I can tell, everyone else has jumped into computer science because they think they're going to be the next Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and become millionaires by writing a program. That was really sort of the genesis of the whole geek lottery concept. Now, we don't tend to have problems identifying that there are people who are naturally gifted at math, at music. How many of you know music majors? Have a friend, have dated, so on, okay? I dated a music major my freshman year, and I decided that was one of the hardest majors on campus. Because not only do they require you to do all these really tough things, but you have to be talented. If you have no inherent music talent, you cannot make it through as a music major. You just won't be able to keep up with what they demand of you. And what the problem is that I saw, and I still see, is that the demand within human civilization for information technology workers greatly outstrips the number of people who actually have aptitude for it. And so you get a lot of people who get sucked into IT and get hired and get used who really aren't very good at it. This gets back to the quote I told you when I took 404 as an undergrad, where the visiting, from industry, the visiting professor said, you know, if you knew which ones to pick, you could go out and shoot half of all the people working in IT, and not only would no deadlines be missed, the number would be advanced. There are some real dysfunctional issues, and you're going to find this when you go out in IT. Now, the fact that you've all made it to your senior year in computer science or related industry says you have aptitude. How many of you have tried to teach programming to a roommate or friend who's like in business or something else? What's it like? I had this. My year after my mission, I had a roommate who was in business, and he had to take an MIS class where they had to write some simple COBOL programs. And this was a bright guy who I suspect has gone on and had a very successful business career. And I thought, this is so obvious to me what you need to do. And it was like Greek to him. Actually, I studied Greek. Greek's not an easy language to dig into. But if you've had that experience of trying to explain the basics of programming to someone who doesn't have natural aptitude, let me turn it around myself. I ended up in choir in high school. My hardest class in all of high school. Took me 3 semesters to get an A. I still have great sympathy for Bruce Bastian, who sat next to me for that first year and had to try and sing with me singing next to him. The only reason I got straight into choir instead of going through men's glee and washing out was because Mrs. Pitkin, who was my honors geometry professor, refused to let me transfer out of honors geometry. I actually ended up becoming a decent, not a great, but a decent choir singer, and so on and so forth. So my freshman year at BYU, I signed up for Music Theory 101 for non-music majors. And I dropped it after 3 weeks. Okay, you know, I was on 3rd semester calculus, you know, I was an honors student and so on and so forth, and I got 3 weeks into this, and it's like, none of this makes sense to me. I am lacking something intellectually that this is just, the music theory just is not clicking. So this is a problem. Now, about 10 years later, I expanded and revised this to an acronym I call TEPES, which are what I consider the 5 qualities roughly, and I emphasize roughly in order, in evaluating and hiring IT personnel. And this was based on having built the team at Pages, and having screened and hired contractors at OSG and so on. We get back to the talent. Now when I say talent, it's not a single talent. It's more like D&D. You know, you've got about 6 talents, and you've got about a, 3d6 roll on them and so on. And you're looking for people who are up at, 16, 17, 18 on some key talents there. So you have the talent issue, but I have hired talented people who or in the case I'm thinking of, the person who took over management for me, have later fired. Because even though they were very bright and very talented, they were so disruptive to the team that it finally became just unsustainable for them to be a part of the team. Education. This has been a debate for 40 years. Well, you really need a computer science degree to be a good programmer. No, you don't. Again, back to Peter Lentz, had a GED. Probably the single brightest programmer, single most talented I've ever hired. But what I discovered when I graduated from BYU and started at General Dynamics was a lot of what I had learned here in terms of data structures and algorithms and various odds and ends had immediate applicability for real-world programming issues. And what I saw were a lot of people who had gotten into IT without some of the basics of computer science reinventing or failing to invent concepts which I suspect are obvious to everyone in this room. Professionalism. I have developed a lack of tolerance for prima donnas. I know firsthand that someone, however bright he or she may be, if they are disruptive to the team, if they are holding the team hostage, fire their butts. They are not worth having. They can destroy a team, they can destroy a project. Professionalism doesn't mean wearing a suit and tie. Thank goodness. Because a lot of IT jobs tend to be high pressure, high stress, I'm a great fan of having fun. I like Nerf guns. I like, weird decorations. I have an animatronic chimp head in my office at home, which I mostly use to terrify the grandkids. Once they reach a certain age, they sort of get over that. But when they're younger, they tend to be terrified of coming into my office, which I see as a good thing. That's it. By professionalism, I mean show up, get your work done. Play well with others. Raise issues in a timely fashion. Don't be passive-aggressive. Be outspoken. And you're going to find this is a challenge because you're going to run into managers who don't know what they're doing. Trust me. I will probably late in the semester have my daughter Crystal. She's the one I mentioned who graduated from the U in computer science 3 years ago. Working for a company here up at Thanksgiving Point. She really likes the company, but she's had her share of problems and frustrations there. And she and I talk on a regular basis, and I say, okay, here's what you want to do, here's what you don't want to do. But ultimately, we're back to the question that we had, I think, last week, where someone talked about how do you change an organization. My comment was, the only way to do it is go in each day prepared to be fired, and if you're not positioned prepared to be fired, then you're going to have to live with what you've got at work, at least until you can find another job. Which is actually the best solution is have another job lined up. Dad 102 here. My kids heard this all growing up. Never quit your current job until you have a new job lined up. I've stressed that, and some have not paid attention to that to their great detriment. Employers are more willing to hire you if you have a job than if you don't. It's the old, what's wrong with her, what's wrong with him? They're not working, no one's hired them, or they're not working for anyone now, there must be some problem, therefore I don't want to hire them. Experience. Experience is where you learn things from. Years ago, when I was with OSG, we were looking at placing a software architect for a corporate client, and Bruce Henderson, a longtime friend and colleague, was doing some of the screening, and he did a interview with this candidate, and I said, well, what'd you think, Bruce? And he said, well, he says he's sharp, he's good. He says if he were fishing and I had caught him, I would have thrown him back in the lake to let him grow a bit. there are some things that experience teaches you. As I mentioned in this particular article, I went through, Pages was a year late in shipping. That was the most painful year of my entire 40 years professionally. Because I was having to go back. I mean, I'm chief software architect. I'm one of the co-founders. I'm having to go back to the investors every month and say, well, here's our new deadline, and their question is, then why should we believe this one? Because you've missed all the ones up till now. That's when I became, that's when I had all the optimism worked out on me. And that's really when I started my professional focus on why do projects fail. Because up until then, quite literally, every job I'd had, I delivered stuff on time. You know, sometimes we changed features and so on, but I, delivered. This was my biggest project to date, and it was a year late, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I had done wrong and why we were so late. That's some of the most, failures are frankly some of the most valuable experience. I hate to tell you that, but that's where you can learn. Skills. If all other things being equal, it's nice to have someone skilled. Sometimes doing a project, you're adopting new technologies, and it's like, well, no one's really done this. Pages, startup, we're working on Next Step. No one was an experienced Next Step developer. The machine had just shipped a year earlier. Except one, Bruce Henderson, one of my first hires, actually did have some Objective-C experience, but I think he was the only, and I had Objective-C experience because I'd written the next book for Addison Wesley and had chapters in there on programming on the next. I don't think anyone else had any Next Step experience. But they were great programmers. It's like, okay, you guys can learn this. Here's some manuals. Now, for those of you who have been out in the real world and have dealt with people of varying levels of talent, educational, professionalism, experience, and skills, what have been your observations? Any feedback? Anyone? Yeah.
I will say just, experience is a big one. I mean, even with just working in a particular architecture, as it were, because I mean, it's like,
yep.
I work for a company that got several products that have been around for like 10 years or so, and so people who've been on the project for a long time, they look at something and they know what it's doing.
Yep.
Everyone else looks at it and says, I haven't looked at this yet.
Yep. Yeah, and it can be important, and frankly, what you will often see in more mature organizations is that the valuable people, particularly those in maintenance, tends to move towards professional experience skills end of the spectrum. You want someone who knows those either long-term shipping products or long-term internal critical systems, who know them well, who can, when a problem crops up, and say, oh yeah, I know what's going on, it's going to be this, and someone just did this, and we need to go back and do this, and who have expertise, have skills with these specific technologies involved. Particularly as some of the technologies age, you have the syndrome where often your brightest programmers always want to work on the newest technologies. And that can cause a problem if you have products or internal systems that rely on older technologies, finding people who are willing to work on it. It's like, who wants to program in COBOL? Yet there are billions of lines of COBOL in production, even as we speak. And there are a lot of old, secure COBOL programmers who have jobs for the rest of their lives as long as they want them, because they're helping to keep these systems running. Any other thoughts, observations? Yes?
So, with the skills part of it, one thing that I've noticed is that if somebody has, education and experience, then the skills can be learned pretty quickly. Like, at Domo, there was a guy who got hired who'd been doing C# development for a long time, and Python after that, and had never done any Java. All that we did was Java, right?
Yeah.
And so he got in there, and he was able to actually finish stuff within the first week or two.
Yep.
He was able to deliver tasks just because he had enough experience that it wasn't that big.
Well, yeah, if you're moving from C# to Java, it's kind of like,
Right.
you learn, I have to do this, I don't do this anymore, vice versa. And that's why, oh, by the way, and Luke Coleman, and I should put his book on the list of extra credit reading. A friend of mine spoke to me once with some horror in his voice that he'd just interviewed a programming candidate, entry level, who just graduated from a 4-year institution with a BS in computer science and had never programmed in any language other than Java. It's like, what kind of program would put you for 4 years and only teach you one language ever? I assume they've got a comparative languages or algorithmic languages course, whatever, here in the department, or just enough that gets you around. Back when I came through, we actually had a class where we spent a semester programming in about 8 different languages.
Right, there's one of those.
Huh?
It's like 330 or something.
Yeah, and that sounds about the right number. So that was the sort of thing. But once you've sort of hit 2 or 3, you got procedural, object-oriented, functional, and you've got some experience, picking up a new language isn't that hard. I've done that on a number of occasions where I had to do some data analysis on the case I was working on, and I've been doing a lot of programming in Java, but I poked around and thought, okay, the only thing I can read Python's going to be a lot easier. So I spent a couple days playing around with Python and then wrote. And again, I wasn't doing an application, I was doing something that was simply pulling relevant data out of massive data sets and then organizing the way I could do other stuff with them. I did it in Python, and it was no big deal. I've been doing object-oriented programming for 25 years. Yes?
This is just another comment.
Yeah.
So I had the opportunity to interview some people for a startup over the summer, and I found that the vast majority of people have education. That's like the new high school diploma, right? But like nobody had anything else. Like, it's so sad. The majority of people in the IT industry just are deadbeats. Like, it would be great if they had at least one of those things.
Just one other thing other than education.
Yeah. We actually found that a great determining factor was if they were just passionate about anything.
Yeah.
Like, if they are, then they can be passionate about CS, but yeah, there wasn't a lot. So.
Which reminds me, back when I came back here in '85 and was teaching, and you had to actually apply and be accepted. You had to take 142, you had to pass with a certain grade level, and then they had some other screening to accept. I mentioned this to Wayne Holder, who, my high school friend, he and I were the ones who did Sundog Frozen Legacy together, the computer game. And Wayne's sort of a hacker's hacker. I once saw Wayne install CPM on an 8-bit game console through the joystick port. I mean, I'm in awe of Wayne. And I mentioned this to Wayne, and Wayne said, he said, screening's easy. He says, you put them in a room with a bunch of really cool, cutting-edge hardware and a bowl full of money, and tell them they can either spend the day playing on the computers or they can fill their pockets and walk out. He said, keep the ones who play on the computers. And it's sort of the same thing. You want that passion. He's like, wait, we're students, we like money. I agree with you, that passion there. It also brings up one of the hardest things for me to learn over the years was how to screen and hire people. Because I've had people who looked great on paper and came through great in resumes and turned out not to work well. And this is one of those painful truths I guarantee you're going to run up against. I found the single best predictor for success in hiring someone is a recommendation of someone's opinion who you trust. Someone who has worked with this opinion and says yes. That's, again, back to Peter Lenz, the 23-year-old with the GED. I had hired a programmer out of Arizona, Rick Gessner, and he'd come through a recruiter, and Rick was great. I like Rick. But Rick said, Bruce, there's this guy back in Arizona. He said, you got to hire him. He says, his resume is not going to look like anything you want to touch. He says, but trust me, this is the finest program I ever worked with. So based solely on Rick's recommendation, I brought Peter in, put him through the interviewing process, hired him, and he's still one of the best hires I've ever made. So someone else, I think, had a hand up. Yes?
I was just gonna say 2 weeks ago, I applied for a job and there was like 10 other people they were looking at, and they were looking for someone with like Unity experience, and I've done that for the last year. And I don't think it was just that I had experience that they hired me, but it was just that like I had all of these personal projects to show them
Yes.
that I'd done, you know, and I think, like, I mean, just thinking of people I've worked with too, like, I don't know, you can't really put your finger on it, but if you know that someone's working on something outside, like, you know, what they do with their free time, like if it, like you said, it's playing around on computers, putting stuff together, like, I think that says more than just the fact that they've done that, you know?
Yep.
It's like,
Okay.
I was just going to second what you said about recommendations. The company I'm working at, when I started or interviewed last year, we had 10 people, and right now we're at 30. And so all the people in the past year, like 20 people we've hired, have all been through recommendations. It's like we hired an iPhone guy and an Android guy together, and then they had a recommendation for our backend guy. Since they were all like knew each other, we just kept having this whole chain. Not only did I could verify that they were solid people, also they worked together really well.
Yeah.
And that has just been huge
Yeah.
benefit.
Let me drag on too long here. Last one, Dead Sea effect. This is something I first observed at Fannie Mae in the mid-90s. When I noticed that their internal IT, I was there as a consultant. In fact, I was there managing about 20 to 25 consultants who were working at Fannie Mae. But they had a big internal IT department too. And what I observed was that their best people, the best Fannie Mae employees in IT, were all leaving and going off and becoming consultants. And over the period of 2 years, I saw the quality of the overall quality of the personnel in the IT department of Fannie Mae just sort of steadily decline. And the image that came to mind was the Dead Sea. Dead Sea, of course, is over in Israel. Jordan, fresh water flows in. There's no outtake. The water evaporates, and the Dead Sea just gets saltier and saltier. In the years since, I have seen this in a number of organizations. In fact, when I first put this article up on my blog, someone linked to it on Slashdot. And I got this big spike of traffic for about 5 days. And I've actually seen references to this elsewhere. This seems to be a phrase that I've coined that has been picked up and used elsewhere. But and this is just for this, not all IT organizations this way, but when you have a dysfunctional IT organization, you have people coming in, your best people leave, and it just becomes less productive, less functional. It doesn't mean this isn't unique to IT. I have had some people who linked and said, yeah, I've seen this in the mining industry or in this other industry. And it's certainly not true of all IT organizations, and it doesn't necessarily mean that all people left behind are incompetent. Some people stay because they really like the job regardless. Some people stay because they have, certain security issues for being there, or they're just very well paid. But this is something to keep your eye out on when you are interviewing for jobs, is to try and assess the quality of the organization itself. You may find yourself in an organization that after a few months you decide you want to leave for exactly this reason. Any questions, observations, any of you experienced this? Yes?
Well, I wanted to actually ask, I can't remember which of your readings this was in, but it was talking about hiring,
Mm-hmm.
and how when you hire, you'll go through 10 resumes to find one applicant who you're interested in, and you'll call them. Of 10 calls, you have one come in, and of those 10 interviews, you hire one. So that's 1 out of 1,000 resumes. And granted that there's not 1,000 students in this class, there's a low likelihood that we would have been hired by you. So what can people do in order to become more competent and better, I guess, programming, besides programming?
Well, what I'll say with that question is that you're all fourth-year CS students. At this point, you do represent probably the upper 1% of people looking for entry-level jobs out there in the industry. May not seem like it, but there are a lot of people who see programming as the... my former wife was a registered nurse and midwife, did a lot of home births. And she's done midwife education for 20 years. And one of the issues she has is she sees a cadre of practicing midwives out there where she says her qualifications are watch a birth, have a baby, catch a baby, and then they're qualified as midwives. Of course, my wife is an RN. She has, or not my wife, former wife is an RN, has her case full of medical texts and everything else. Has studied this, has developed state-approved curriculum for midwifery training and so on. And you'll see something, the same thing in the IT industry. You'll see people who say, hey, I can get a job programming. I'm going to get it, such and such certification and apply for a job and go. If they're talented, they may actually do very well, but there's a lot of people you're going to face out there who really aren't that good or aren't that talented. Yeah.
So this is sort of related to that. I've not looked into it much myself personally, but I've heard a lot about it. Where there's this, maybe you're familiar, there's some program where they teach you programming for like 3 months, really hard and
Dev
fast.
Mountain.
Sorry, what was the name of it?
Dev Mountain. Or
Dev Mountain. Have you heard of that?
I've seen billboards for Dev Mountains. There are camps that say, we'll teach you how to code in 2 weeks.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, if you're talented, you may discover you like coding. I don't think it produces a software engineer that's necessarily worthy of hiring. Any more than when I came back from my mission. I mean, and I'm not trying to sprain my arm here, but I'm an honor student, relatively bright. I'm on full scholarship and so on. I changed my major to computer science. I come back and apply to this language translation project. They don't start me off saying, oh yes, we're going to have you start coding this stuff. I didn't know how to program it. I knew almost nothing, actually I knew nothing about software engineering. So they said, well, we'll have you punch in some data. And we'll sort of bring you along for a year or so, and when it looks like you're ready to contribute with code, we'll start looking for small projects to have you do and so on. I think the biggest advantage of things like Dev Mountain or some of these dev boot camps and so on and so forth are for people who have not had exposure to programming to discover that they really like programming and that they're good at it. They don't do much for people who just don't have a natural aptitude. It's the analogy I used in the Real Software Crisis article is one of music. Imagine if suddenly, for businesses to merely stay in business, much less compete, you all had to have orchestras. So you'd see people taking, learn to play the violin in 2 weeks. They would hire in people who knew how to blow in the right end of the clarinet, and so on. And what you'd see is this tremendous influx of people going into music, most of which would not be very good at it because they wouldn't have the practice, they wouldn't have the talent, they wouldn't have the skills. But here and there, you'd see places who knew how to hire, who would actually put together a very effective ensemble. That's a lot of what you'll see in IT. You'll see organizations where you walk into the IT organization, it's like, I can identify within the first 2 weeks here which people really know what they're doing and which don't, or you walk in, it's like, oh my gosh, this is so great. These are all great developers or people who know what they're doing. It's great managers. And there you go. The 10-10-10 rule. I've had a few other people challenge me on that. I don't know if I actually looked through 1,000 resumes for every person I hired, but it was probably several hundred resumes. I went through a lot of online resumes. And if anything, it was probably more like 20 to get one I would call, 10 I would call to get one to bring in, and probably brought in 5 for everyone I hired. It took me a year and a half to hire a total of 8 developers and pages. I was very picky. And it was just hard to find them. Let's take a break. Let's do a biology break. If you can all be back in, I'd like to give you some time at the end of class. We've got 2 more things. One is going through Brooks, and one is talking about your requirements document. And then the rest of the class period will be for team meetings. So let's take a biology break, and as soon as everyone's back, we'll start. I'll take a roll and start.